In this lecture, we're going to create a scriptable object. The process is very similar to creating a component. We must define a class with instructions for creating the scriptable object. Our first step is to create a file. In Unity, navigate to the scripts/character folder. Within this folder, create a new C# file called character_stats_so. It's common practice to add the letters SO at the end of the file name. This naming convention helps other developers identify scriptable objects. Let's open this file in Visual Studio Code. Let's modify a few things. Firstly, let's remove the start and update methods. Next, remove the system namespace from the file. Lastly, let's create a namespace called rpg.character. After creating the namespace, move the class into it. Creating a scriptable object requires one step. Currently, the class is derived from the MonoBehavior class. This class instructs Unity to treat the class as a component. However, we're not trying to create a component. We want a scriptable object. Scriptable objects can be defined by changing the class from MonoBehavior to scriptable object. That's it. We've created a scriptable object. Let's add some data to the class. As mentioned before, this class will be responsible for setting the stats of our characters. Let's define 4 stats. The first stat will be a public float variable called health. Let's set the initial value to 100. This variable will store the health of the current character. Next, define another public float variable called damage. The value for this variable will be 10. This variable will store the damage applied to other characters during combat. Afterward, define a public float variable called walk speed. Enemies are currently slow. During patrols, they're likely to walk around instead of running. However, if they spot an enemy, they should start running. To toggle between speeds, let's create a set of variables for the walking and running speed of a character. This variable will store the walking speed. Let's set the initial speed to 1. Next, define a similar variable called run speed with a value of 1.5f. We're getting close to finishing. The last step is to create this file from Unity. As far as Unity is concerned, we've given it instructions for creating a scriptable object. However, a scriptable object is not automatically generated. Unlike components, scriptable objects cannot be applied directly to game objects. So, how do we create a scriptable object from this class? We can do so from the Create menu. Above the class, add an attribute called Create Asset Menu. I'm introducing a new attribute. This attribute adds a new menu item to the Create menu. Through this attribute, Unity will create a file based on the class this attribute is applied to. In this case, we're creating a scriptable object from the character stats class. This attribute has 3 parameters. The first parameter is called file name. Let's set this parameter to character stats. Initially, we must provide a default name for the file. We can configure the name through this parameter. Next, let's add another parameter called menu name. Set it to the following value, character_stats_so. The menu name parameter will configure the text that appears within the Create menu. We should set it to a human-readable name. Lastly, add a parameter called order with a value of 0. Positioning the menu item can be done through this parameter. The lower the number, the higher the placement. The higher the number, the higher the placement. In this case, we're moving the menu item to the top. Let's try testing our code. Switch over to Unity. It's common practice to have a directory dedicated to scriptable objects. In the Assets folder, create a new folder called Scriptable Objects. Next, right-click within this directory. At the top, our new menu item appears. Let's click on it. After doing so, a new file gets created. This file is entirely based on the class that we created. Looking closely, the name of the file has the same name as the file name parameter. Let's set the name to enemy stats. Awesome! We've created our first scriptable object. In the next lecture, let's take the time to create stats for the enemy and the player.